Welcome to Functions and Python. Functions. Today we will learn about functions using the programming language Python. What is a function? A function is a block of reusable code that performs a single related action. Functions provide better modularity for your application and a high degree of code reusing. Here are the components of a Python function. First, we have a definition word, def, so you define the function starting with def. Second is the function name. In this case, it is add. Third, you have function arguments that are inside the parentheses. Next, the colon ends the function definition. 5 is the function code. Here we have print and return in the area, and the function return statement, which is return. More on Python functions. In Python, function blocks begin with the keyword def followed by the function name and parentheses. Any input parameters or arguments should be placed within these parentheses. You can also define parameters inside of these parentheses. The first statement of a function can be an optional statement, the documentation string of the function, or docstring. The code block within every function starts with a colon and is indented. The statement return expression exists a function, optionally passing back an expression to the caller. A return statement with no arguments is the same as a return none. Let's talk about using functions. Defining a function only gives it a name. Once the basic structure of a function is finalized, you can execute it by calling it from another function or directly from the Python prompt. Now we've just learned what functions are and the components of a function. Now let's learn how to use a function. There are several types of functions within Python. We have a user-defined function. There are built-in functions, what's known as the lambda functions, as well as recursor functions. For this lesson, we will use user-defined functions. We also need to understand the concept of variables for this lesson. Variables are used to store information to be referenced and used by programs. Python variable types include Python integers and floats, strings, Boolean and none, lists, dictionaries, and other data types. Python and PyCharm. PyCharm is an integrated development environment, an IDE. Basically, an IDE is a graphical user interface that developers use to write code and produce final results. There are many IDEs that can be used with Python, but I chose PyCharm for this lesson. Python and PyCharm example. For this lesson, I'm going to use functions in Python to understand how to convert the US dollar to other forms of currency to understand the currency conversion rates for different countries. Disney World locations. Since I like to make coding fun, I'm going to make this a fun lesson. This is my son Michael. He wants to visit every Disney park on Earth. We've already traveled to Disney World in Florida, but since there are also Disney locations around the world, I wanted to understand how much it costs to visit Disney locations around the world based on the US dollar. I will use both Python and PyCharm to create a program to convert the US dollar to other currencies. So first, we looked up the exchange rates for the countries that have Disney parks. There are parks in Shanghai, which use the yuan. There is a park in Canada, which uses the Canadian dollar. There's a park in Paris, which uses the euro. So as we can see, the euro conversion rate is 1.154. The Canadian dollar conversion rate is 0.7436. The Chinese yuan is 0.1433. And the euro for Paris is 1.154. Let's talk about how we create a Python file in the IDE PyCharm. Now that we have the US dollar conversion rates for the euro, Canadian dollar, the yuan, we want to create a new Python file in PyCharm. We do that by right-clicking on the Python program file and selecting New Python File from the menu. Next, we want to name the new file. I chose Currency Converter since the script will convert currencies. Script variables. Next, we need to define the variables. Since there are 4 different currencies, there will need to be 4 different variables. We need a variable for the US dollar, for the euro, the Japanese yuan, and Canadian dollar. Conversion rates in a Python script. In order to create our Python script, we have created the variables needed to calculate the conversion. For the first variable, we are actually establishing our budget and using US dollars. The second variable is the US dollar to the Canadian dollar conversion rate. The third variable is the US dollar to the yuan, and the US dollar to the euro is the last number. Again, these are current numbers for July 21st, 2020, but it may change as these rates vary daily. Let's talk about the print and calculate functions in Python. The next step is to use the print function and calculate functions to determine the US dollar rate for the 3 conversion rates. Here's what it will look like. We've entered a print statement or print function in order to be able to see the printout in the console. Now that I'm done writing my program, the final step is to run the program. To run the program, I will select Run, then Run again, and select the program that I would like to run from the list. For this example, it is Currency Converter. I got an error message. Why did I get an error message? Because I used a comma in the US dollar budget amount of $2,000. You cannot use commas in Python, so I removed the comma and then I reran the program. Once I reran the program, we can now see the current rates for each variable has printed in the console. But what if my budget changes? The US dollar budget variable value was hard-coded into the program, preventing users from changing the value. The program needs to accept input for the US dollar budget field to accommodate a changing budget. Lucky for us, Python has a built-in math function to solve this issue. Python math functions include a round plus round, an integer, as well as a float. I will then need to use the float class function since the numbers have decimals. To solve this issue, I also need to pass an input function into a float function as not to convert the number into an integer, an int, so that it is not converted into a string. So what I've done is I copied and pasted the information from the currency converter file, and I will now paste that data into a new file with the additional functionality needed to have an end user dollar amount inputted. So creating a user prompt. We needed to create a prompt so that the user can enter the US dollar budget amount. To do this, I will update the US dollar budget using the float function and the input function to prompt the end user to enter the value. As we can see here, we have a float function, the input function, as well as a prompt for the end user that says enter budget for trip. Then I will run the interactive converter file. So I will again go to run again. From the list options, I will select interactive converter. The prompt is now displayed, and the user is now prompted to enter a budget amount for their trip. I have entered a budget amount of $3,000 minus the dollar sign and the comma. I now have my new US conversion rate based on an increased budget. Voila! Here we come Disney International locations. Let's take a quick overview of our functions in Python lesson. In this lesson, we learned what are functions, the components of a function, how to call a function, what are the variables, the Python calculate and input functions. Thank you for watching this lesson and happy coding.